Ladies and gentlemen, I am Paul, U.S. Army combat veteran. It is September 29th, 2022. This is your daily Ukraine update, and we are going to be covering just all the madness happening as Russia tries more and more to do damage control. We've got the pipeline that they've probably destroyed. We've got Lyman imminently falling out of Russian hands. We have Russia folding the Ukrainian breakaway provinces into Russia. This is just a huge news day. So let's get into it. Okay, first off, we're going to kick it off with the tactical map. And as you guys can see here, there's been a couple of significant changes, right? When we take it back, we can see that first off, Ukrainian forces have steadily been expanding this. It's really more than a bridgehead now, but they have been fighting to link up their bridgehead at Kupiansk with this expanding front off of the Oskil River. Again, the only bridgehead that they seem to be just holding steady is just this bridge at Dvorichna. Seems to make sense, right? They maybe simply want to make sure this bridge is secured and be devoting their combat power to Kupiansk. When we look to the south, we see that Russian forces in Liman are in imminent danger of being cut off. You can see here from the 27th, the 28th to today, there's been a real effort to encircle them. Ukrainian forces have pushed Russians back near Yampil, and when we look at Lyman, we can see that there's very few ways out for Russian forces, right? Basically, in terms of major roadways that can move troops quickly, you have two. You have this 0526, which will take them, of course, straight into Ukrainian territory. Not a great call. So they're limited to basically 0528, and they need to evacuate their entire defensive force here through this narrow roadway past here. But as you guys can see, Ukrainian forces are, let's see, at their closest point, it looks like maybe 4 kilometers away. That's almost within small arms range. So this is a real problem if Russian forces cannot hold, or even worse, if Russian leadership is too myopic in their vision to even give the withdrawal order, right? They need to preserve their combat power. They can't afford to lose it. But Russia, as we're going to see, seems to be getting increasingly desperate for ways to try to solve or at least mitigate some of these problems that they're experiencing. Now, moving over, we see that, well, we're going to move over to the news, and because there's so much of it. So, as always, we are turning to ground.news. This is a source that aggregates news across the political spectrum, letting us see bias. You can try it for free through my link in the description. And let's take a look at just a couple of stories. The first is that Russia seems to be doing some pretty desperate damage control over the damage done to the Nord Stream pipeline. And this is sort of preposterous. Russia is arguing that the Nord Stream leaks occurred in a zone controlled by U.S. intelligence. Now, this is weird because if you know U.S. intelligence agencies, one, there's really only one U.S. intelligence agency that has the authority to do anything outside the United States, and that's the CIA and the NSA, I guess. But the key is that they don't control anything. They can't. They don't have armed forces. They don't have their own ships. They don't have their own troops. They don't control things. And it's not clear what that even means. You can see Al Jazeera, a center, says Russia says Nord Stream pipeline leaks were in U.S. zone, which this is nonsense. It's a pipeline feeding to Europe. Right, Putin's mouthpiece alleges U.S. intelligence controls area where Nord Stream pipeline occurred. This is ridiculous, and this is someone who, again, when, for example, Edward Snowden leaked his information, it was very clearly factual because it aligned with what we know U.S. intelligence already does. Russia has no evidence for this, and this is sort of preposterous. I don't even know why I'm granting this. I'm granting this the airspace so you guys understand that the fact that this isn't even like a kind of convincing lie, right? In the way that, say, the referendums, you massage the vote, you count all the blank ballots as yeses, you do that sort of thing, and you end up with something that has a veil of plausibility behind it. This is nonsense. This is like saying that the CIA is going to move Mount Everest. It's not possible and also makes no sense, right? If you want a good conspiracy theory, you should argue that you have irrefutable evidence that like German military intelligence did it to hurt Russia or something. Like pick someone who at least has an interest, a controlling interest in this pipeline, right? The U.S. is a natural gas exporter. Wouldn't we want, we wouldn't care about the Nord Stream pipeline. Anyway, here's another one. Here's a better one. European security officials have said they observed Russian Navy ships in the vicinity of Nord Stream pipeline leaks. This is from CNN. So some of these are vague security sources, but they seem more credible simply because this is in a region near Russia. And frankly, when we look at the incentives here, when we look at who has the incentive to disable this pipeline, the answer is pretty clear that it's Russia, right? No European country is going to disable their own pipelines. And the United States would not want to do anything to interfere with the flow of natural gas to Europe, because that is the number one reason that Europe may break with the United States over this Ukraine conflict, and that is a shortage of natural gas, right? The electorate in these countries, it's easy to support the Ukrainian forces as a hypothetical, right, as a line item on a budget. But when you can't afford to heat your home and then you have to go to the polls and it's, January, February, and it's been freezing, or you've spent, what used to be a $50 monthly bill is now a $500 monthly bill or a €500 monthly bill, then that risk of losing support is considerable. And the U.S. definitely needs Europe to stay shoulder to shoulder on this Ukraine policy. The only person who would want to ratchet up the pressure on Europe as a result of their support to Ukraine is Russia. There is no other country with an incentive to do these things. And so when you have, obviously that's how you can discern, in some cases, lies from truth. One is the actual sources themselves. Again, Russia, who has a track record of making shit up and also saying something that doesn't make any sense, versus European security officials saying that, hey, Russia, who has a huge incentive to disrupt the flow of natural gas to Europe, was in the vicinity of this pipeline, right? Russia operates in the Baltic, and the Russian Navy is exactly who would be doing this sort of sabotage type of operation, right? So this is something I want you guys to understand, that this is geopolitics in action for sure. When the goal of Russia is to make this war and supporting the Ukrainian forces in this war as punishing as possible for Europe. This is a last-ditch effort by Russia. And you should probably understand that if you're thinking to yourself, man, this seems like Russia's sort of shooting itself in the foot by destroying their own natural gas sources. And that's sort of true, but remember, Russia is not subject to elections. The Russian people will go without, and Putin will remain in power. The Soviets proved that is a viable method, that people can suffer pretty immensely and keep the existing power structure, the existing government in place. European governments are much, much, much more subject to people's discomfort, right? And so if you make the Putin's calculus is that if he makes the European voting public slightly uncomfortable, that will be sufficient to break their support of Ukrainian forces. Now, that's not all. The Kremlin has announced 4 regions of Russia to be folded, 4 regions of Ukraine, to be folded into Russia on Friday. And you could see this is just covered across the political spectrum. And by just about everybody, you could see it's covered. Putin annexed 4 Ukrainian territories, formally annexed 4 regions, and annexation is exactly the right term. There is no evidence that this was a fair or legitimate referendum, right? You can't do a good election under military occupation. It just doesn't work. Believe me, if there was a way to have a truly free and fair election, the U.S. would have figured it out in Afghanistan. 20 years, we couldn't figure out how to make it not sort of like feel coercive, right? And that's what the U.S. actually trying not to, trying to have it feel as neutral as possible. When I was in the Afghan elections in 2010, and we were told, do not go to a polling place. You cannot enter within X meters of a polling site because it will be seen as too coercive. Russians certainly didn't have that problem. They had no problem having armed military, literally dragging people to the polls. And we saw the people counting. There were some funny videos of them clearly having unmarked ballots and just being like, oh yeah, all these unmarked ballots are yeses. It means the same thing. But the reason Putin is doing this, there's a couple. First is to make a stronger case for general mobilization. And that would mean that, of course, if it's the difference between the U.S. staging a draft to go to Vietnam, which is massively unpopular, and the U.S. staging a draft to, say, defend Alaska or Hawaii from a hypothetical invasion, right? The continental U.S., people would be much, much more supportive of a general draft to defend those sites. Also, by folding them into Russia, they will enable Russia to draw from that military-aged men in these regions to force them into conscription and to fight against fellow Ukrainians. If you think that seems like it could be very problematic for Russia, again, their calculus is that they will be more productive even to have these forced or coerced fighters than it would be to just have, real regular volunteers. And undoubtedly within these regions, there may be some volunteers, but most of the DNR and LNR already has a universal conscription and has fielded troops for some time now and taken tremendous casualties by most reports. The other reason is, of course, to scare the West. And one of the biggest fears that Russia is obliquely referencing is the fact that every nuclear-powered country reserves the right to defend its sovereign territory, its territorial integrity, with its nuclear weapons. And Russia wants to create the largest legal smokescreen possible to make the West reluctant, or at least doubt itself, that seizing back this annexed Ukrainian territory, it might be treated as Russia as a existential threat and use nuclear weapons. But Putin isn't stupid, right? There's no evidence that he is a madman or any of these other things. He's a calculating politician who is backed into a corner and is taking higher and higher risk actions, but his calculus remains solid. And the truth is, if Russia was to use nuclear weapons offensively, it would, in all likelihood, even isolate it from its allies like China, who do not want to be seen as supporting this sort of escalationism, right? China, of course, is next to India, another nuclear-armed power who it has a rivalry. It has a rivalry with the United States, a nuclear-armed power, and it supports North Korea, another nuclear power, and it does not want any of these countries to believe it's normalized to use offensive nuclear weapons, certainly not to achieve non-existential political gains like seizing parts of the eastern part of your neighbor. But Putin just wants to put the fear of God into the West and make us as Westerners, not certain and believe that there is a significant risk inherent in supporting Ukraine. I think it's mostly a sign of desperation, if we're honest with ourselves. Okay, guys, that is all I had for you for today. I know it's a lot. As always, guys, if you want the combat video breakdowns that YouTube has censored and said I can't show you guys anymore, those are all on the Patreon. I do every 2 weeks. I do 3 or 4 reactions in kind of a single batch video. But also, I just appreciate the support the Patreons give me. You guys really make this possible. Thanks to my Lieutenant tier patrons, and I'll see you guys in the next one.